Radio.
All right, now let's get into our conversation. Professor Kofi Abotire is the Dean of UPSA Law School, and Professor Bafo Agyeman-Duah is a governance expert. I suppose maybe we can start with some sort of definition of terms, right? And if you don't mind, Prof. Abotire, I'd love to start with you. And we're talking about the Ghana we want. First of all, I mean, do we not want this Ghana? What is it about this Ghana that requires improvement or change?
Well, first of all, I think in the absence of a scientific research, we can all generally agree that there appears to be a general dissatisfaction with the state of things in Ghana since we turned the page on constitutional rule in 1992. The general expectation after we started constitutional rule was that we're going to have the delivery of public goods in a manner that was better than what it used to be pre-1992, i.e. the military era of 1981 all the way to 1992. I think there's a general consensus, in some sense, in the absence of a scientific research, that we have not been able to deliver that Ghana. That Ghana where social goods are equitably distributed, where things are based on merit, that Ghana where people feel a sense of nationhood, that Ghana where citizenship means something, and therefore people actually can literally quantify the benefit of being a citizen. That Ghana where generally there's a sense of satisfaction of the governed in expectation of the governors. I think there's a general sense of dissatisfaction, which has been 30 years in the making, and it appears to not be improving from year to year, from election to election, from term to term. I think it is on that basis that perhaps there's a general clamor of a certain Ghana, which is an ideal Ghana. I mean, some would say it's an idealistic Ghana, idealistic in the sense of we are speaking of the state to which Ghana should aspire. But that's the whole essence of governance. The whole essence of governance is that we move from a certain state of suboptimal performance, and our expectation is that we get to that state of expectation. I mean, that state of ideal achievement, actualization. I don't think it is an utopian expectation. I think it's a realistic expectation. It can be achieved if certain indices are in place. The reality, unfortunately, however, is that from election to election, we seem to come to a conclusion that we may not have gotten it right, right in the sense of what we expected vis-a-vis what was actually attained.
Now, Prof. Bafo Agyeman-Duah, I know that this idea of having a unified vision for our nation is, I mean, it's globally the norm. In any nation that works, there is a unified vision from which nobody deviates. Yes, how to achieve it, there may be disagreement on that, and there may be different approaches, but what they want to achieve never seems to differ, except in Ghana, it seems. Why that obstacle, and how do we even start to shape a solution to it?
Good question. You see, nations that have had a unified vision for development, if you look at such nations, you find certain commonality. First of all, the ideal, as my good brother mentioned earlier, you need an ideal to guide development of a country. America has it, other countries have it, as you said. But it all depends on the political system at work. In a democracy, certainly we need to build it on good governance. And that good governance will ensure the ideals that all societies seek, like peace, justice, fairness, prosperity, and other things, those values that we all want. But for development, you need more than that, which is that to have a unified vision, the system should simply provide for that. Let me be practical. As we have it today, multi-party, that unfortunately has degenerated into extremism. We have two parties. And maybe the history of our politics in this country, beginning in 1947, has something to do with that. Because since that time, we have always had sharp divisions in ideas. Not even to talk about the founding and the founders. No, I'm not going there. But from that time, the division, the breakaway of the CPP from the UGCC seemed to have created certain enmity between the two sides. And that has grown over the years and manifested in the founding of political parties. I haven't done a real research to really buttress what I'm saying, but it's clear if you look at the things. Now let's come to our Terran Republic. Maybe because of the past experiences, we decided to have this kind of political system. And I think when you have a political system where there's extreme partisanship, it's always difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to pursue a unified agenda for development. I'm saying this because if you look at countries that we cherish today as developed, you can look at Singapore, you can look at Malaysia, you can look at Rwanda, you can look at what else? South Korea and all that, those countries. Clearly, their political system for their development is not what we have in Ghana. I know there was a time in the United States, after the recession in the 30s, they came up with this idea of uniting for peace. Uniting for peace. In other words, when they realized that division in the country retarding progress, they found a way to unite in order to move the country forward. So in the same way, if we are concerned about what we have today, and we are looking for a way to create a better Ghana, the Ghana that we want, then it seems to me that we should seriously consider how we bridge the gap between these two dominant parties. That is to say, if we are not going to recreate the system, but we are going to pursue this current system, which in my humble view is an obstacle to the issue that we are talking about, then we need to find a way to bridge that gap between the two sides. You know, Nkrumah started with a 7-year development plan. But you see, that was under a dictatorship, one-party state. So you can do that. There was no problem. Then, somewhere on the line, we had the 2020 Vision 2020 or something like that, I think under the PNDC. And we did what we could, but again, partisanship derailed it. After they left office, we didn't hear much of it. Of course, the Constitution established the NDPC, National Development Planning Commission, which is supposed to lead the planning and development of our country. Again, because of partisanship, whenever government changes, everything at the commission changes, no matter how hard they've worked to create anything for us. That also changes. So in a sense, we do not move forward. That's why I'm highlighting the difficulty of this duopoly that we have and the fact of extreme partisanship that seems to draw us back all the time. So my point, just to conclude on this point, is that, look, if we are serious about creating a Ghana that we want, which have been very well described by Professor Abu, then we need to seriously reconsider the political system that will enable that to happen. But in the present system, I'm afraid that's going to take us a long time to achieve those goals.
Wow. Your answer is realistic but slightly depressing. Prof. Abuchi, maybe this is a good point from which we can actually start with some specifics, of the building blocks of what this Ghana should look like. I mean, there are so many areas to discuss. We couldn't possibly touch on all of them. I mean, economic growth, environmental sustainability, social equity, cultural preservation, governance. I mean, there's no way we can finish it all in one day. But we can start with the building blocks. So, in terms of governance, what is a realistic goal that we can put before those who want to lead us from 2025 onwards, those who are putting themselves up for election? What sort of governance goals can we demand from them if they are to be worthy of our vote?
Well, first of all, we need to remember that we are not constantly in the cycle of elections. Again, unfortunately, for the better part of 30 years, we have usually been in the cycle of elections, constant cycle of elections. And what I mean by that is when one election ends, we never settle down to govern. The next election begins on January 8th. So a president is put in office on January 7th. And then on January 8th, typically we're supposed to have governance starting for the next 4 years. Unfortunately, we continue the elections. And so we have this cycle of campaigns that starts from the next day, and governments in power are seeking to constantly politically validate their projects, while opposition parties are doing all they can to politically discredit them. Some will say, but that's what the whole game is about. That's not what the whole game is about. Opposition parties are supposed to keep government on its toes in terms of doing the work of governance, not in terms of trying to dislodge them while in office. And government is not supposed to constantly be campaigning on projects and failing the real task of statecraft and the real task of governance and leadership. And so we need to move away or shift a bit away from that dynamic of constantly just governing, constantly just campaigning as if we're in the mood for another election. We need to settle down and govern. And settling down and governing means that we need to adopt bipartisan approach to doing things. We need to remember that in the interregnum between one election and the other, we must govern. The people who give government the mandate are expecting outputs that have nothing to do with politics, but outputs that have everything to do with the state. It is part of the reason why we have now come to the point of the winner takes all. Because anytime elections end, governments are thinking of the next election. And so they are driven by how to finance themselves for the next election. That financing process takes the form of political compensation. And the political compensation is designed to ensure that persons who supported the previous elections are financed adequately to support the next election. And how they do that is to compensate them with positions and to ensure that they're economically sound for the next election, for the purpose of financing the next election. So it's important for governance purposes. It's important that we settle down to govern and move away from election. But the next point I'll quickly add in this respect, in terms of what to expect from a governance standpoint, is that we must begin also to avoid the tendency of privatizing electoral gains. We tend to privatize electoral gains. So while elections are generalized, all of us go out there to vote, all of us participate in the electoral process. Indeed, it is a civic responsibility. The gains and outcomes of elections are privatized. And what I mean by this is that we fundamentally reserve the gains of elections for the winning party and its cohorts. So you have to be a party member. You have to be a party card-bearing member. You have to be supporting the party. You have to be known to be a member of the party or supportive of the party. And the general question is often posed, is he one of us, for purposes of getting key goods and key deliverables of states? And so in this sense, we have privatized the election itself. We privatized the outcome of the election itself. But the process of the election, all of us participate in that. And so go to the polls to deliver a government, but that government comes to power and the government sees itself as representing only a section of few. That mentality, again, has endured for the better part of 30 years, and regrettably so. It is part of the reason why the generality of Ghanaians who don't belong anywhere, so to speak, who only care about the state and who care about Ghana, actually pay a price for that. They pay a price for not belonging anywhere because everywhere suspects you. You are either for A or B, or both A and B suspect you, and in the process you are an outcast, so to speak. So again, from a governance standpoint, we must pay attention to this. Another important and fundamental governance consideration that we have to look at is what I would call informed leadership. I think as part of the winner-takes-all or a fallout, a critical fallout of winner-takes-all dynamic is that we have generally had a deficit in informed leadership. Because government often has a small pool of people to select from out of the generality of the country being the government in power and its people, those in opposition, and then those who don't belong anywhere. The generality of the people tend to give government a larger pool of talent to select from, and therefore you will have informed leadership if government is to select from the generality of Ghanaians. But because there's often a smaller pool of people to select from, that smaller pool of people being the winner-takes-all pool, i.e. you belong to the government in power, the president, who's largely the one who does the appointments, is constrained and tends to have a smaller pool from which to select the people who lead Ghana, generally speaking. Now, we have suffered from this because in Ghana, this may be okay. But if you consider this from the standpoint of the fact that the people who negotiate at the table at major international transactions, at major meetings of global and multilateral governance platforms, at that level, nobody cares about the fact that the person you selected is a party person from Ghana, and the fact that the person has a narrower horizon and perspective of things, and the fact that the person is not as educated as one would expect, and that the person is not that deep. That person will face a counterpart on the other side of the table to negotiate major transactions on behalf of Ghana. What that leads to is the fact that we are constantly shortchanged. And that's why if you look at the number of our transactions from which, sometimes key questions are raised, major international and transnational transactions, people ask the question, how did we ever arrive at this point, including loan negotiations? How did you arrive at this point? And one may only have to dig deep into ultimately who represented Ghana in that transaction and and whether or not an input, of course, that the person made. And one will come to the conclusion that ultimately the winner takes all and a largely uninformed leadership has accounted for some of the difficulties that we've encountered. So I'll just leave it here as the conversation goes on. But these are some of the considerations that one needs to make. A lot of our problems are deep-rooted, and they have been culturally deep-rooted from the standpoint of how we started the entire constitutional era. The constitutional era was premised on the platform or pedestal of anger, of animosity, of enmity, of frustrations, and people who did not want to engage. Unfortunately, that dynamic has endured to today.
Prof, listening to Professor Abuchi, sorry, this one is to Prof. Bafwa Agyeman-Duah. Listening to Professor Abuchi, it's quite obvious that even the way we think about governance is problematic. This idea that we as citizens only come in when it's time to vote, and that in between we just sit back and watch those we've chosen to do whatever they wish. I remember when President Akufo-Addo announced his rather large number of ministers, and he was questioned on it, and he said, well, just wait and see what results I give you with this large government. And we all sort of said okay and sat back to wait. We abandoned the simple fundamental idea that this large government is going to cost us money and we ought to find a way of achieving the results with fewer people. We abandoned that and just said, okay, let's wait and see. This is just one example. There are many examples of this peppered across the Fourth Republic, where we go and vote and then we sit back and let them do whatever to us for 4 years. Is there perhaps some sort of way of conveying a message to the typical Ghanaian that their role in governance doesn't only come up every 4 years?
I don't know what kind of message, the difference it will make in the system we have. All the salient points made by my good friend there relate to the point I made in my earlier submission about the kind of political system we have created for ourselves. When you talk about privatizing electoral gains, you talk about exclusive governance. The present system permits that. It's the Constitution. It's permitted. When you talk about winner takes all plus uninformed leadership, that's separate though. Winner takes all is allowed in the Constitution. When you talk about what happens in between elections, so now we are asking me what message can we send to citizens to know what to do, it's also a constitutional issue. And I will explain to you why. The Constitution, even though has a provision for decentralization, which would have created active citizens at the local levels, for some strange reasons, none of governments we have had in this republic has taken a serious note of that to help to achieve the goals of decentralization. So, with the over-centralization in Accra, everything is directed. That's why after every election, as Professor Abochi said, you see no active participation or actions on the part of the people, except in Accra. A true decentralization will ensure that throughout the year, at the local level, district level, people will be engaging in their own self-development, in their development, the development of their districts and their areas. That is to say, after you have created the structures, that will ensure fiscal decentralization, where a proportion of the national revenue will go to these districts, plus their own generation of revenue in their areas to help them to think and plan and take action for their development. For me, that is the crux of the matter. Look, if we want citizens to be active, first we have to find a way. National elections, electing national officers alone is not. It will not. And as he rightly explained, the way the system is, you win power, you just simply collect your own people, those who supported you, to rule. You go get loans, those who supported you or those you appointed, to rule. And in the end, you find that you have excluded the people, qualified people, in all these processes because perhaps they didn't vote for you or they don't belong to your party. This exclusivity in our government is a major problem we need to overcome. And you can only overcome it if you restructure the political system. I guess when we talk about restructuring it, of course, our mind goes to the Constitution. And I know people who think the Constitution is okay. It's just the human agency that is failing. But the fact is that the system allows these agencies to do what they do. You see. So I think, for me, a solution to this, if we are not prepared to unify, you can call it unity government, coalition government, whatever, if we are not prepared to do that, then we should seriously pursue the decentralization project that will minimize the winner takes all. Because in a decentralized political system, a winner cannot take all. Because if I won in a Jesu or Bimbila or wherever, I will be responsible for that place. You are not taking all. At least my party person, if, for instance, I'm a minority party and I won a place in Yeji or wherever, we are in charge there. So we are participating directly. So I think there's a way we can do that in order to minimize, if not completely negate, the way we run our governance, and we have done so for the past 30 years. I think all the points made by Professor Abochi on target. Political parties privatize electoral gains. In fact, it's like going to war and winning, you take all the booty away. And if you listen carefully to some spokesperson for these two major political parties, if you listen to them carefully, even though the campaign is not in full swing yet, you hear them talking about when we come, we will do this, right? When we come, we will do this. Not in terms of projects, but even including what they will do to the opponents. They are not talking about those critical issues that will take us out from the predicament, economic mess that we have in the country. They say so, but in some very faint ways. So I'm saying that to get an active citizenship, because that's the bottom line of democracy, all of us should be actively engaged. But we cannot be, all of us cannot be actively engaged if we have a winner-takes-all system. We have an exclusive system because the winner will privatize the gains to his members only. When elections become the dominant force, because you win elections, next 4 years is coming again, what do I do? And that even leads to corruption, because you have to mobilize funds, and once you're in charge of the state, you have access to wealth. And therefore, you mobilize through corruption so that you can win again. So for me, frankly, in as much as I'm in love with democracy, I think the practice of it in our country, in itself, the practice of democracy, has become a major drawback in our forward movement.
This one, it's one of those existential conversations, one of those conversations that if we pay attention and take it forward, could actually be the seed from which a new nation grows. Professor Kofi Abotsi is the Dean of the UPSA Law School. Professor Bafo Agyeman-Duah is a governance expert. Both of them no strangers to our show, and so far they've been guiding us through some very deep thinking, and we appreciate that. I want us to take this to the next level, and for this next question I would like to hear both of you give us your take on it, starting with Prof. Abotsi, if that's okay. And I'm just wondering, you've made it clear, Prof. Abotsi, that governance doesn't only happen at elections. Now, we are 4 months away from an election, and governance can happen now. It doesn't have to happen only on the 7th of December. So right now, is there a way that we can force all of these pretenders to the throne, all of these potential leaders of our nation, to actually commit to what is our vision of a better Ghana? Our vision, not their concept of, and we've heard them with their slogans of one this, one that, and 24, 48, 72-hour economies, and we've heard all of that. But can we get them to commit to what we want? When we talk about a Ghana where the youth doesn't want to just pack their bags and leave, a Ghana where people in public office don't treat it as if it was created for their personal gain, how can we get potential leaders to commit to delivering that instead of whatever they perceive to be their vision for the future? Prof. Abotsi.
Well, the truth of the matter is, it is not that easy to get political actors to make commitment by which they will stand. That's the truth of the matter. The reality is, democracy as we practice in it was not the effective democracy of old, where every adult male had a say, and the distance between the government and the governed was closer. Today, we have to govern through institutions, and so the institutional interface is the only way we can achieve some success if we really want one. And so we can't all demand. We can't all, 34, 35 million people. We can't all demand and we can't all hold to account, because it is just not practicable and it's not feasible. The institutional interface in this context, therefore, are of two kinds. The first is the hard institutional interface, or that's what I call it. I call it the hard institutional interface. And that is the Parliament and the judiciary, the SRAJ, the Auditor General, the institutions the Constitution has put in place to demand accountability. So if Parliament can be effective, Parliament can demand a certain degree of accountability of political actors. But of course, the pre-electoral promises that agents and actors make Parliament cannot hold them to account because it wasn't, or they were not promises that were made in office. Parliament can only hold official promises or official actions to account and not pre-electoral promises that people make on campaign platforms. And so that's one weakness in terms of the parliamentary party, in terms of the question you're asking as to how can we hold them to account. And therefore, therein comes in the media. It is only the media that can guide all of us on that path of accountability, pre-elections and post-elections. Now, the reason the media is powerful in this context is because the media's accountability is one of political accountability. So the media says you made a promise X. Have you fulfilled it? We heard you made the promise. We played the promise back to Ghanaians. So you can't even deny that you made the promise. And now, in respect of that, we want to check whether you have actually fulfilled it by a certain benchmark that we are setting for you. I think this is one area in which the media of Ghana has both succeeded and failed. Succeeded in getting Ghanaians broadly to be focused on some of the key issues. And so these days, politicians are careful, or hopefully will be careful, in promises that politicians make because they know that there will be a benchmarking, they know that there will be a rate tracing, and as some put it, the internet never forgets these days. And so the media can help all of us on that path of accountability. But the media also have failed in that sense, in some ways, because the Ghanaian media is heavily fractionalized. It is heavily fragmented. And because you have politically connected persons also owning the media, the conversation is distorted. And so it is easy for the media to deny its own statements. It's easy for the media to deny its own position. It's easy for one part of the media to say X and for the other part of the media not to say Y, but to also say not X. It becomes complicated. The conversation becomes convoluted, diluted, and totally confused, especially for the uninitiated. And so it is important that we see the role of the media. The role of the media as interfacing the 34 million Ghanaians who can't all hold government to account except through elections, and then the hard institutions of state who have also largely failed, especially Parliament, largely failed to hold government to account because Parliament has come to also see itself, especially the majority party, often sees itself as extending the mandate of their party in the executive. And so Parliament has become weak from regime to regime. And so the media, which has become the only last bastion of hope, unfortunately has also sometimes, or in many cases, failed to hold government to account. And the way that has happened is because of the political infiltration into the media, by reason of which the conversation has become distorted. I'm sorry, I'm throwing out there more problems rather than solutions. But the reason I'm trying to draw attention to this is because our solution itself has been problematized. And that is one complication that we have. We have solutions that have become part of the problem, and we need to take out the problem out of the solution in order for the solution to become a solution. For accountability purposes, I still do not see a much more powerful tool than the media between elections. The only way we can hold government to account outside of the media is for promises government makes while in office, not pre-electoral promises, if we are to use Parliament. But for pre-electoral promises, only the media can hold government to account.
Prof. Bafo Agyeman-Duah, your take on the same issue?
Well, you know, I have been involved in these matters for the past 20 years in the country. So, from my perspective, let me tell you up front that I've become very pessimistic about still putting our trust in parties and individuals and their goodwill and all. I don't believe in that anymore. That is why these days I'm really interested in changing structures, because if you don't change structures, look, the media, the institutions, there were years we were spending a lot of money and energies doing what we call institutional building, capacity building. The media have been taken to seminars all over the place many, many times. You know that. Conferences here and there. Maybe as I grow older, I become cynical about some of these things. That is why I think, you see, the promises politicians make to hold them accountable, in what sense? They make the promise. In fact, despite the glaring failure of meeting promises today they are still giving promises that are even more awesome than previous promises, So look, to go straight to the point, I think at least the Constitution provides for decentralization. Let the media, civil society hold the government accountable on that. The constitutional requirement. We have only achieved administrative decentralization, and that is something the government, central government appoints. They appoint the DC and other officers by the ministries. Now let's look for political decentralization as well as fiscal decentralization. And we can go on to discuss this in detail, but all I'm saying is that we need to begin to capacitate local people, citizens, to take charge of their own lives, so that ministers from Accra and government in Accra is not always directing what should happen in the districts. Let's give the districts some room, some independence to think and plan.
Yeah,
I think that's the first point.
Okay, I mean
the second one I think I can think of is if we can get the political parties to come to a consensus that for the sake of our progress, maybe they can think of a period where there will be national consensus on our development agenda. If the NDPC, for instance, is encouraged to, and with the full participation of all of us, to develop a 20-year development agenda, then there should be a national consensus that we are sticking to this. And if this party comes to power or the other party comes to power, there will be a greater respect for that nationally endorsed agenda. You see, because this notion of coming in, bringing my own agenda, whether it's Agenda 111 or Agenda 200 secondary schools or Agenda this, Agenda that, it doesn't help, because the next government comes and everything is turned upside down. So I'm looking for a kind of a consensus building on how we go forward.
Consensus building on how to move forward. All right. I mean, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you will. I mean, it's not as if those who seek to lead us have absolutely no competence or ability in improving Ghana. That can't be the case. So let's give them some benefit of the doubt. Prof. Abuchi, listening to what has been said so far, the promises, the slogans, the manifestos, listening to what has been offered so far by those who want to lead us, are there some elements that you hear in what they are saying which would indeed contribute to the Ghana we want?
I will not want to specify anybody's campaign message, so that if I fail to mention another, I'll be accused of bias. But it is true, and again, as Prof has said, it is true that we cannot do well unless we long-termize, and then that's the word I'm making up, unless we long-termize our policy prescriptions. I get the sense that both sides are still being very short-term in their perspective. I'm saying both sides because these are the two leading parties. But in many ways, are still very short-term in their prescriptions. The things they're saying are good. There's no doubt about that. They all seem to have good intentions. Good intentions about improving the economic loss of Ghana. Good intentions about doing things that are better than the status quo in the past. Good intentions about improving things. I can understand that. But we need to put things on a long-term perspective. And I think I can't agree more with Prof that we have gotten to that point where we need to remember the need for a blueprint. The Constitution itself has given us a blueprint. If you open to the directive principles of state policy, there's a blueprint there. We just need to situate things within the context of the blueprint. The question is, what is the blueprint for both parties? To what extent do they converge? What are the points of consensus? And are there key things that we should take out of our politics? I worry that we have politicized everything. It is one of the things that undermines the Fourth Republic. The Constitution has created the state and created the political. The political revolves, but the state is stagnant, or the state is supposed to be stable. So like all good engineering pieces, there is a fulcrum. There is the standard thing that holds the system together. And then there is the fulcrum of things that move around. The state is supposed to be that stability that remains. Government comes, government goes. And that stability is supposed to provide a foundation. And so the public services, for example, the civil service, that is supposed to be the state. We have politicized everything to a point where these days you don't frankly see where the state begins and ends and where the politics begins and ends. They have literally become merged into one, and they've been merged into the politics, so that everything is political. So we need to get these fundamentals right. If we have the state clearly distinguished from the politics, a lot of the chaos that we see will not be the way it is. It is part of the reason why people who are not supposed to be known politically are beginning to show their faces politically, because they know and think that that is the only way they'll be incentivized, and that is the only way they'll be retained if a certain party comes to power, and of course they'll be kicked out when another party comes to power. So I think that fundamentally we need to ensure that we have blueprints on the basis of which we operate. We cannot continue this haphazard tendency of a particular party is in power, all policies are discontinued, another party comes, the other policies are discontinued, and we are constantly, once again, back in the cycle of elections and trying to demonize and bastardize what parties do, which we think do not fit squarely with our own party's thinking. So I think the long-term way of doing things and thinking, while, again, clearly demarcating the boundaries of the political and the government from the state, those boundary delineations are important in order for there to be stability at certain level, and then we can have the changes at another level. If the entire system changes every time there's an election, and I can't wait but to hasten to add that the passage, for example, of the transition bill into law was another part of the problem, to the extent that any time there's a new government, all boards will be dissolved, and then new boards will be appointed, as if the boards are not supposed to be technical bodies, but technical bodies advising state-owned enterprises, technical bodies advising the universities, advising entities that are supposed to be for the state. Once there's a new election, we have to sweep the entire board clean. We have to clean up things and start afresh. The whole system has been politicized and rendered electorally dependent, and it is killing how things work. And I know, Prof mentioned something about some people think the Constitution doesn't have much of a problem. Prof and I are very good friends, by the way, but I think he was throwing a shade in that respect, because this is my perspective on this. I don't think, and I still maintain that, I don't think the Constitution is fundamentally flawed. I think there are problems with the Constitution, but they are minor. They can be managed. The problem is not the people, the Constitution. The problem is the people. We can have a perfect Constitution tomorrow, and I guarantee you, Prof, they will corrupt the Constitution and render it unworkable and in a manner that only fits their whims and caprices. It is therefore a culture mindset that has to change. But there are plenty things that have to change, as well, which you mentioned. And I do believe that the state, from the politics delineated, as well as having a broad national blueprint on the basis of which all the parties operate, so that there are only policy detailed differences between the parties. That is what we expect. Not detailed differences on everything, to the extent that there is nothing broad. There's no broad consensus on anything. No broad consensus on foreign policy. No broad consensus on education. No broad consensus on defense. No broad consensus on agriculture. We must have broad consensus on the basis of which detailed differences, and then those detailed differences are what differentiates the parties for which we go to elections and elect one party or the other. Thank you.
Yeah. Prof, Bafo Ajimandua.
It's chicken and egg. I don't know which comes first. With the present system, it's hard for me to imagine NDC, NPP taking the same blueprint and working from there without any major reversals. I'm just thinking maybe it's possible, but you see, that's why, in my view, if there's a way for us to fashion a national consensus, including the parties and civil society and all stakeholders, that for the next 20 years minimum, we are moving in this direction. The reason I'm emphasizing this is that the countries that we adore for being developed over the past 50 years, all of them had a consistent policy implementation headed by committed leaders for no less than 20 years. Singapore, Malaysia, Rwanda, you name them. People think if you go that way, then you are going to undermine democratic governance. Well, there may be some reasons for that. But look, I don't think democracy, if it's not putting food on our table, if it is dividing us, if it's not achieving the goals of democratic governance, we should just continue on such a track. I'm not calling for, no, we got to revitalize our democracy. The essence of democracy remains universal and is permanent. The practice is where the differences are. If you look at all democratic societies, they practice democracy differently according to their environment, according to their culture, according to the context of their politics. It's all clear. So we should not tie ourselves to what we have created. That is really a problem for us. That's why I get a bit uncomfortable trying to project what we have created as if it is sacrosanct. Just 3 days ago, look at Bangladesh. With all their constitution and everything, citizens charged on the prime minister. She flew, right? Flew out to India, and now they're having an interim arrangement. Those things happen. After all, if one crazy soldier picks a gun tomorrow and say, I've taken over government, what will be the constitution? Then also the constitution say we should resist, we should fight. Come and get me to hold a gun to fight the soldiers. Is that right? So I think in our sane minds, we should begin to acknowledge the serious difficulties of the way we are practicing, the way we have structured our politics, so that we can, in a very sober way, revise and restructure these things to bring some kind of sanity, to reduce the corruption, to do away with the winner takes all or minimize it, this exclusivity in the governance. All these things that are continuously oppressing us. So for me, decentralization is a major component. Taking some powers away from the central government is another component. The way we conduct our politics is another component we have to look at. And all this, we don't need to overthrow the Constitution to do it. Sane minds can sit around table from place to place and get inputs and recraft it. We should be masters of our own destiny. So for me personally, in as much as I love the Constitution, I'm telling you, we need to revitalize it.
Like I said from the beginning, the vision is shared. The methods may vary, even between our two panelists, but that's how you build a nation. At the very least, we share a vision. Isn't that wonderful? I want to say a big thank you to both of you for starting us off, because this is only the beginning. And we know that as the conversation continues, we can expect even more contributions from you as we delve into other aspects of this, what strategies we must put in place to actually hold leadership to account and commit them to a unified vision, what that unified vision must look like step by step, brick by brick. Whether we can use our past as a predictor of our future. All of these aspects of the conversation are to be explored, and we will certainly do that with many voices, including Professor Bafo Agyeman-Duah, governance expert, and Professor Kofi Abotsi, Dean of UPSA Law School.